This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Breshit series, These Are Our Heroes, where we're exploring with our guests a central figure from each Parsha, asking them what is meaningful, inspiring, powerful, challenging, and thought-provoking about their behaviors. Barbara and Joel Rich have sponsored this podcast in memory of the 5th yahrzeit of Barbara's brother Shmuel Yosef ben Reuven. His commitment and sincerity to Torah learning inspired those around him. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office directly. Parshat Miketz opens with Paro's twin dreams, which interestingly parallel Yosef's twin dreams. Thankfully, the chief cupbearer remembers Yosef's dream interpreting talents, and he is called from prison and makes his monumentally important impression on Paro, both by interpreting his dream and offering unsolicited advice how to prepare for the years of famine. It is a life-changing moment that catapults him into a new and blessed direction. Never again will Yosef be derailed from his train to greatness. He even names his son Menashe, which is explained as he who causes to forget the suffering in my parents' home. Yosef announces that his life has turned a corner. And yet, in the following scene, due to the years of famine, he comes face to face with his brothers. The past is harder to bury than Yosef imagined, and while he has risen to greatness because of dream interpretation, the stuff of his first dreams have caught up with him. Yosef does not reveal himself to his brothers and speaks with them harshly. He offers them food in return for an imprisoned brother and a promise that they will return with Binyamin. Unbeknownst to them, he places food and money in their bags. He acts with an enigmatic combination of kindness and cruelty. The brothers later return with Binyamin, desperate for more provisions. After inviting them to a regal meal, replete with abundant food and filling their bags with clothing and money, Yosef sets up the final goblet test, framing Binyamin as a thief. The Parsha ends with the brothers in great distress at the prospect of Binyamin receiving the death penalty. Today I'm thrilled to be back in this chair talking Torah with Dr. Ayelet Hoffmann Libson, who is an associate professor of Talmud at Bar-Ilan University and was previously a visiting professor at Harvard and Penn Law Schools. She is also a graduate of the Matan Advanced Talmud Institute and studied for several years in the Midei Loz Halacha program. She is the author of Law and Self-Knowledge in the Talmud, and Ayelet is currently a Kitvuni Fellow at Matan, where she is working on a book of introductions to each tractate of the Babylonian Talmud, highlighting central themes of each tractate and tentatively titled On the Threshold, Gateways into the Talmud. Ayelet, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast again.
It's a pleasure to be back, Yosefa.
I love how you sort of waver between the world of Talmud and Tanakh, or at least with me, we get to talk about Tanakh.
That's true. It's mostly with you.
Mostly with me. So there is a lot to unpack. We, in our conversations so far surrounding the Yosef story, we've spoken a little bit about his character development, but I think today we're going to sort of focus more on his life trajectory and the different events that have really shaped who Yosef becomes and the Yosef that we meet in Mitzrayim, in the land of Egypt. So why don't you jump into that, sort of in how we can look at Yosef, both in the macro and also sort of the micro picture of this parsha, which spans quite a bit of time, but we sort of get like a broad sense of where his life has taken him. So
right.
Bring us in there.
Yeah, so when I was reading this parasha and thinking about Yosef's life, so the expression that came to mind is mi'igra rama lebira amikta. From the Talmud uses this expression, and it means from a very high roof to a very deep pit, right? And obviously the pit is literally the story of Yosef's life. But he really begins his life as a favored child, as this kind of golden boy, and then he's thrown into the pit. First, he's thrown into the pit by his brothers, and then later he's thrown into another pit, into the prison, by Potiphar's wife. But in our parasha, that all happens in the previous parasha, but in our parasha, that image is reversed, and he emerges from the pit and goes back to being on a very, very high roof. And he becomes the second most important person in Egypt. And to me, against this backdrop, which you could see as a kind of story, this transition and maybe even a story of redemption, right? Yosef can feel like he had this U shape where he went really deep down, but now he's come out of the pit and he's risen to be this great person again. And that really raises the interpersonal question against this redemptive story. Why does Yosef behave in the way that he does to his brothers, right? You could imagine that he would just want to now close up all these loose ends and make peace with his past. But in our parasha, we have a really extended story of Yosef mitnaker le'echav, right? Really like not showing them who he is and testing them again and again.
Very often it says mitnaker with a kaf, but it also feels like mitnakem, like he's taking revenge on his brothers.
That's
right?
true.
The kuf.
Definitely.
Like there's something there that, and we question his motives. Now, his brothers behaved horribly. No one's trying to justify that. And at the end of Yosef's life, his perspective on his life of, atem itkavantem lera'a, but Hashem had a different plan. You intended to do bad. He never says to them, nah, it's okay. Nah, I forgive you.
Yeah.
It's not a story of forgiveness. And we look at them and we sort of, we see like a protracted trail of I don't know, of hate, of revenge, of trying to bring them down in kind of the way that he was brought down before they can then be brought up. And it's also so interesting because Sefer Bereshit doesn't seem to criticize Yosef, meaning we don't have that sense. We don't have even the small negative words that we have to describe some of Yaakov's behavior that the narration of Sefer Bereshit provides. We don't have any of that by Yosef, which I think is why, like, when you read it simpler as a child, you kind of like go through the story, and then one day you wake up and you're like, why did he do that? And I think part of it is because it's narrated very smoothly. Like you side with Yosef throughout the story until at some point you say, I don't know. I'm not sure that was the go-to route that could have happened. It could have been a much shorter story and a simpler story. So I'm just echoing the challenge, but I think that the narration of it also supports the fact that it takes like another turn until you say, wait a minute, like, why does Yosef behave like that? And I keep going back to previous conversations we've had in this series about, being critical of our forefathers, and I'm mindful of that, but also I think we do need to be like candid with ourselves and candid with Yosef and ask that question about
right.
how could we, why does he go, not why does he go down that route? What comes of it, or what can come of it for him?
I think all the stories of Bereshit, focusing on one character at a time, allow for a kind of examination of the psychology of each individual character in the story. And Yosef's story is really the most protracted in Sefer Bereshit. So we get a lot more material. And in that sense, I think, he's really one of the most important heroes of the story. You could also say that in a way, as you said, you read the story one way, he's a hero. You read the story slightly differently, he's an anti-hero, right? But he's a hero in the sense of a character that we can identify with. And I think that the most important thing about this story that every single person who reads it can identify with, and perhaps as we get older, we can identify with it more and more, is how much the past impacts our present.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, when you're 10, you read it in a certain way because your past is more limited. When you're 50, you read it in a completely different way because a story which is about how the past impacts your present is going to look different when you have more of a past and more, skeletons in your closet.
I think like a decade ago when I was hanging out a lot around Brene Brown's ideas, if that name means anything to anybody who's listening. So I remember that I loved the prism of like, if you don't make peace with your past, it will come up, it will catch up with you. And like that prism has still always resonated with me regarding Yosef, like meaning that story was way too big for it to actually be left in Canaan. You can adopt a new culture and you can adopt a new language and you can become super believable in your new garb. But if that story we don't make peace with it, then it's going to come back and haunt you. So we'll go into that because the way that Yosef seems to start to make peace with this story, as we said, said, kind of raises questions, right? Like it could have just been, okay, we'll close it up. But instead it's like, no, let's open it up deeper. Let's make a new pit essentially for the brothers. And then we're going to come out with something that's very different.
Yeah. So I want to offer a couple of different interpretations to what's going on here. The Ramban famously suggests that Yosef's life is guided by the dreams that he had dreamt in the previous parasha.
Suggesting that they're prophetic also.
Exactly.
Which is a question, whether those dreams are prophetic or it was a nice idea that he maybe needed to listen to or not listen to.
Right. So he sees the dreams as a prophecy that needs to be fulfilled and that's what's guiding Yosef. And it's true that there are psukim that seem to emphasize that this is how Yosef understands his reality. Because when the brothers come to him, the pasuk says, "Vayavo achei Yosef vayishtachavu lo apayim arza." They came and bowed down low to him, and this caused Yosef, vayizkor Yosef et hachalomot asher chalam lahem, right? And then he remembered the dreams that he had dreamed. So he's interpreting his reality now in light of the dreams that he had dreamt, right? And let's just remember that Yosef in Parashat Vayeshev dreamt 2 dreams. So in the first dream, he just dreams about an abstract sheaves of wheat that are bowing down to him. And in that dream, everybody bows down to him. In the second dream, there's the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, which Yaakov himself interpreted as the brothers and the father and the mother all bowing down to Yosef. So according to this interpretation, Yosef says, okay, I see that the first dream is coming true, that they're coming to bow down to me, but the second dream hasn't come true yet because where is my father and my mother, right? So he is trying to make that reality happen. Everything that he's doing to the brothers, he's doing in order to lead to the second dream in which the brothers and his father and his mother will come down to Mitzrayim. But according to this interpretation, Yosef is actually seeing the dreams as holding some kind of metaphysical power. They have to come true. And he's just following the dreams unfolding and waiting for them to come true so that he can be reunited with his father. And, from a different place also, not from the pit, but rather from a place of power. I want to suggest a different interpretation than the Ramban, which is based on a really, in my opinion, brilliant interpretive key offered by a friend of my husband's named Yaniv Heller. And every year we give this Dvar Torah at the Shabbat table because we like it so much. And what Yaniv Heller points to is that the Joseph story, which as we said is very developed, actually includes 6 different dreams in all. We have Yosef's first 2 dreams, which we just described. Then we have, when he's in prison, the dream of the cupbearer and the dream of the baker. And finally, we have Paro's 2 dreams. Now, in each of the last 4 dreams, there's a number. And the number is interpreted to refer to a unit of time. So in the cupbearer and the baker's dream, they each dream of something which is number 3, either 3 vines or 3 baskets. And Yosef interprets these to refer to 3 days. And in Paro's dreams, he dreams of the 7 cows, and Yosef interprets these to refer to 7 years. So if we understand that the numbers in the dreams always refer to units of time, we can take this interpretive key and we can go back to the number that appears in Yosef's second dream, when he has a dream about 11 stars plus the sun and the moon. So altogether 13. And we can now understand that this number also refers to a unit of time. And it's interesting that the Torah itself, in a way that's very unusual, actually discusses different points of time in the story of Yosef and seems to be emphasizing that we should pick up on those 13 years. Because at the very beginnings of the Yosef story, we're told, V'Yosef ben 17 shana haya ro'eh tzon echav batzon. So the story starts when he's 17 years old. And later on in the story, when he's in Mitzrayim, we're told, V'Yosef ben 30 shana be'omdo lifnei Paro melech Mitzrayim. So at that point, he was 30. So it turns out that 13 years passed between those 2 years, and our parasha tells us
between
the dream when he was 17 and when he becomes a grand person in Mitzrayim, and our parasha tells us Vayhi Miketz Shnatayim Yamim, right? So it's actually separating between 2 years in which he was in prison and the 11 years that he was before in Potiphar's house. So it's a very clean parallel to the dream, right? 11 plus 2. So we have this interpretive key that the dreams, numbers in dreams actually refer to units of time. And I want to suggest that what happens in our parasha is not that Yosef feels bound by these dreams and feels the need to fulfill them, but actually that he's realizing, he's looking back on the dreams that he himself has interpreted and realizing that in each of those cases he interpreted the number as a unit of time, and he's now reflecting back on the dreams that he dreamed when he was 17 years old and realizing that they actually also referred to a unit of time.
I think that explanation really it supports the Ramban's idea in the sense of that the Ramban says he went through this process to fulfill the dream, but this idea that you're offering in the name of Yaniv Hillel is sort of like the prequel to that, meaning why does he go through that process? Because all of a sudden, it's not like he was for the past 13 years thinking about, well, how do I make this dream come true? But when they show up, as you said, he puts it all together. And then he says, well, wait a minute. Like, I've just been given an opportunity. Clearly, this is a message from God. And therefore, I'm going to go through a process to now put this dream into some sort of reality. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you can definitely take it in the direction of supporting the Ramban. The slight difference that I would like to part ways from the Ramban is to argue that Yosef is looking at his dreams not as something that he now has to work to complete, like he has to create the reality in order to bring his father to Mitzrayim, but rather that he's saying to himself, okay, this just happened, the 13 years passed, the dream has actually been fulfilled. I'm now standing, 13 years have passed, and I'm now in a different place. Something important is going to happen. And that, I think, is what allows him to undergo a process of beginning to make peace with his past, right? Rather than pushing forwards in order to create a new reality, he's able to say, okay, what happened, and now I need to think, how do I progress from here?
I think, though, that what it doesn't help us figure out is why he then has to behave the way he does. Because in theory, you would say, you're a leader of Mitzrayim, your brothers come, they literally bow down to you. The only person missing who's still alive who could come is obviously one brother and his father. So what he's missing is that piece. And so and then we get this feeling of, okay, well, like, does it have to be exactly the way the dream was? Is it not enough already what it is? And so if it's not enough, then he goes through this whole machination to create that reality. So we do feel that, like, there's a gap between the abstract realization of the dream versus the desire to make it literally a fulfillment of the dream. And then I feel like that's still what we're left with, like a moment of question.
Right. So that's what I want to suggest is that what he's doing now in all of these machinations, as you say, is not only aimed at fulfilling the reality of bringing his father to Mitzrayim, but actually it's making peace with his past in the sense of he wants to put his brothers, he does want to test his brothers, right? And you could maybe criticize the way in which he does that and that he does, he creates so much anxiety and tension for them. But I think that the reason Yosef is doing what he's doing is that he says to himself, the only way that I can make peace with my past is if I put my brothers in the same situation again and I see that they behave differently this time. Yeah. Right? And that's exactly what he does, because he puts them in the situation of
risking themselves for another brother.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's very different. I just want to clarify for myself and for everybody listening. It's different than saying I'm forcing my reality to fit the dream, which is more Ramban, versus saying I see that these pieces are coming together and now I want to complete that picture and make this kind of work in some sort of harmony. There's a lot of disharmony that precedes the harmony, but he wants to get to that space. That's a very different headspace than the way that the Ramban suggests.
Exactly. So it could be, that he's also struggling with a sense of he needs some revenge. But I think this is part of his process of making peace with the brothers, that he says to himself, I'm not able, I'm so bound by my past that I'm not able to just say, oh, let bygones be bygones. I have to test them and see if they have transformed in the same way that I've undergone transformations over the past 13 years in order to be able to be reunited, right? And the truth is, when you look at the end of the story, it's not all like happy at the end of the story between the brothers, right? Like they seem to live separately. They're
worried till their last day that he's eventually going to kill them.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but he's doing what he can in order to make peace. And, I think I just had a conversation with a friend who's struggling with family dynamics. And I'm sure, we all have someone in our extended family or friends. And it's not always possible to achieve the vision of a perfect family or a normal family or however you define it. Sometimes people struggle with tensions for the rest of their lives and have to figure out a way to create distance, but still be able to make peace with that and not be, haunted by their family dynamics forever.
I mean, that's basically the only way that I teach how to understand the Yaakov and Esav ending and Yosef and his brothers. Neither of them become neighbors on the same street in Yeshuv X, in Teaneck. It doesn't happen. They don't want to live next to each other. And that's okay. Meaning, I think the fact that the Torah provides us with that kind of model at the outset is very instructive. Meaning, not all families are meant to live as one, big chamula. And so, Yaakov even pretends that he's going to follow Esav. Okay, see you in Seir, and never shows up, right? It's just sort of like talk in order to, peaceful talk. And also Yosef, he settles his brothers a whole bunch of hours away in a different part of Egypt. That's okay. You guys can hang out there. I'll hang out here. Happy you guys are settled and you have your provisions, but I don't want to live near you, and that's okay. I think that's a very powerful model. And then in the end, we still end the Torah with a picture, we have almost at the end, a picture of everybody coming to the deathbed of the father. And we have Yaakov and Esav showing up to bury their father, meaning there are the things that will always bind us. But I think there's something very freeing about that model that the Torah provides.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so I think, what this test actually does, it bears fruit, right? Like sometimes people know what's right for them in order to make their peace with their family or with whatever in their past is haunting them and they need to make peace with. So Yosef sets this test for his brothers. And what really ultimately releases him from living in the shadow of that past is the dialogue with Yehuda at the beginning of the next parasha, right? Where Yehuda explains to Yosef what we actually already know in this parasha, that Yosef has offered himself as a guarantor towards his father that Binyamin is going to return home alive. And he says, when he says that to his father, he uses the language of guarantorship. And he says, Anochi e'ervenu miyadi tevakshenu im lo heveotiv lach ve'atzegtiv lefanecha v'chatati lecha kol hayamim. So he uses this language of Anochi e'ervenu, I will be a guarantor. And interestingly, Yehuda himself is also echoing a lesson that he learned from his past, because in the previous parasha we have this strange interlude in the story of Yosef, which talks about Tamar and Yehuda, and in that story Tamar teaches Yehuda that obligations have to be fulfilled, and the same term for guarantorship is used there, because Tamar demands from Yehuda, when he doesn't know that it's Tamar, im titen ha'eravon ad sholchecha, right? You have to give me a pledge, an eravon. And that term is repeated a few times in that story. And then Yehuda himself uses that metaphor of Anochi e'ervenu. So I think that linguistic link is also showing us that how Yehuda learns from his past and how his current standing up to take responsibility for his brother is related to the lesson that he learned in his past. And similarly, Yosef is also putting his brothers in a similar situation to the one that in the past they failed, and now he's going to test them and see if they manage, right? It's very reminiscent of the Rambam's idea of tshuva. What is tshuva? Tshuva is being in the same situation that you were in the past and you failed, and managing to stand up and do the right thing in that situation.
I think also one of the biggest stories that looms here in the background, not because of the rivalry, but dafka because of the response to the killing, is the Cain and Hevel story. Meaning, we have here the strongest expression of Hashomer Achi Enochi, meaning that is Cain's question. Like, what do you mean? Is that my job? And the point is that yes, that's your job, and you were supposed to intuit it, but unfortunately, something there went a little bit wrong in the wiring, and he doesn't intuit it. And that is the lesson you see that Yehuda understands. They also don't get it. They also do not protect their brother, even though, unlike Hevel, Yosef was annoying to them, and Yosef provoked them, and their family circumstances provoked them. The Cain and Hevel story is much harder because there is no information provided. It's dafka. I'm very convinced at this point of the reading of that story that Cain is presented with a real chok situation, meaning it's unclear why his sacrifice is really rejected. I'm not really convinced of a lot of those readings, and certainly not the ones that are going to insert negative behavior. In that story, there's no favoritism. He's the one who is the first one to think about, bringing a sacrifice, and not his brother. And in the end, he's not chosen. And
sometimes family dynamics are like that, right? That, you're born into a certain order in your family, which totally determines your life. Yeah. And there's no reason, there's no logic behind it, but you just have to deal with it in a way.
And you still are responsible with protecting your siblings. Mm-hmm. And that's, literally the fatal mistake of Cain. And you really feel the tikkun of that mistake, specifically when it comes to Yehuda. Mm-hmm. Meaning, with Yosef, that's not the feeling we have. He's testing all of them. But the person who stands up and says, yes, my job is to protect my siblings, is Yehuda, who of course doesn't do that in that same way earlier with Yosef. Right. So I just feel like there's also the figure of Cain really looms large here in the background, but obviously in the sense of the mistake he made.
Right. I think also, you mentioned that Yosef doesn't do that, but Yosef's also the victim, right?
Yes. No, I don't mean it as a fault of his. Yes.
Yeah. So, maybe the Torah is also telling us, okay, like sometimes people can't step up to the plate to the extent that you would want them because they have a lot of pain and hurt in them. And then, it's lucky if you have 11 siblings, then maybe someone else will be able to step up to the situation.
The truth is, Ayelet, is that as I was sort of thinking about this parasha, and it's definitely related to a point I am in my life, I'll probably be honest about that. But I was also thinking about sort of this like essential question that comes up, and it does a little bit connect more to the Ramban's reading than the one that you've suggested. But this idea of, if one does have sort of like an image or a plan that they thought, was supposed to be, and then you're met with a life reality that doesn't necessarily seem to sort of like align with what that was. I think one of the questions that this parasha brings up, specifically this one, is how much do we sort of force these ideas or these plans on the life that we're actually living? Because if we look at Yosef, I'm going to go back to that earlier piece, his life seems pretty good right now, right? Before the brothers come and all the mess gets like brought up, everything seems to have kind of worked out for him, and he's in a real high moment, as you framed it earlier. And I agree with you. I think that a lot of what motivates his interactions with the brothers is this real need to see that something in them has shifted. We have other Parshanim who suggest that. The Abarbanel, I think, is definitely one of the earlier ones who suggests something along those lines. But it brings up this question for me in general in life. Like, when is it time to let go of what we thought was supposed to be, or the vision of what was, or who was supposed to bow down to me, or who was supposed to be there, and when do we say that story doesn't serve me anymore, and I do wonder sometimes, like, what would have happened if when his brothers show up, Yosef just says, this wouldn't serve anything anymore. Meaning, and maybe Yaakov wouldn't have ever come. Meaning, maybe that whole piece wouldn't have happened. And of course, in the biblical telling, we're told that this has to happen because it's part of this broader plan of Brit Ben Abtarim, and they had to come. So we're like in a story within a story. We're in this micro, but there's a macro, which said that everybody had to eventually come to Egypt. This is the way they got there. But on just like our regular life level, this question, I really think about it. Like when do we sort of like steer course with like what we thought was supposed to be, and when do we say, I don't know, I think life circumstances have sort of sent me signs that it's not supposed to be that way. In this case, Yosef, I think, feels that the signs are starting to point to the fact that maybe that thing wasn't so off back then. But I don't know, I feel like this is a topic that I think about very, very often.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question. I mean, the way I see it is that Yosef, he had a dream, he had a really powerful sign, and he felt that was guiding his life the whole time. And the point that I was trying to make earlier is that suddenly he says to himself, wait a minute, maybe my interpretation of that dream was wrong. Like, it's not that I have to work for them to bow down to me. It's just that a certain amount of time has elapsed, right? And I think that, we sometimes wish we had dreams or some kind of very strong sign that would tell us what to do. But here we also see the limitations of that, the problems that can arise when you have such a strong sign. And it doesn't even have to be a sign. It can just be like a narrative. You have your life story that's maybe created to a large extent by your family, by the things your parents told you, by the way that, what did they encourage you? Did they say you're such a great student, or did they say you're such a great artist, right? And then you have this kind of vision of yourself, this narrative of yourself, and your whole life is directed according to that narrative until you hit a wall and you realize, wait, this isn't working. Why isn't it working? The dreams aren't coming true. The prophecies aren't coming true. Everything I thought about myself isn't coming true. So what does that mean, right? And I think many of us struggle with that. If we think about people who were always sure they wanted to have a certain career, and then they find themselves, there are all kinds of aspects of that career that they didn't think about, and it turns out that's really not the right career for them. Or people who thought, they need a specific kind of relationship and go looking for that relationship over and over and over again and can't understand why relationships don't work out. And sometimes we have to pivot, and I think we actually have to do active work to reflect on that framework, and it's not so easy. It's really, we are so created by our past. The people that we are the product of our families and of experiences, formative experiences that we've had in our past, and maybe even sometimes signs. Sometimes we have certain sentences that we heard that really resonate with us, and we experience them as some kind of sign. It could be something that someone said to us totally randomly, but it really continues to resonate, and we think about it all the time. And sometimes those signs can accumulate and entrench and, really make us feel like we have to go in a certain direction, which may not work. Like sometimes there's things that are just not possible. They're not opened up to us. I think, like, I often used to say that if I had been born in America and I had been born a man, then I would be a pulpit rabbi. But I was born in Israel and I'm a woman, so I went on a totally different path, right? But sometimes we just have to work in order to transcend that box that we've boxed ourselves into, and really be able to reflect on where else can we go, and not be limited by those signs of the past.
I want to agree with that and also subvert it and say that when I imagine Yosef throughout all of these years, I imagine him in one of two ways. Either he's saying to himself, wow, those dreams were really totally off, because look what my life looks like. Meaning every time he thinks that it's going well, he kind of falls again. And so either he says to himself, oh, this is kind of just wasn't true. It was just a childhood imagining. And then when his brothers show up, he sort of is like, wait a minute, like maybe there is more truth to this than I thought. And another version of who Yosef might have been would have been that he's really thinking about it this entire time, and that every time that he has like a fall, he's trying to figure out how to get himself up again and get back, in the saddle and be the kind of leader that he envisions himself to be. And he also might have experienced both, and he has moments where he says, oh, that just is not meant to be, clearly, because look where I am. I'm in a pit again. And then he might have had moments where he said, no, I'm motivated. Like, this is supposed to be the case. And I think that sometimes we don't even have to let go of the vision of what we thought was going to be permanently, but we do need to let go temporarily, meaning sometimes we need to let that belief go so that it can actually come to fruition in a bigger way. And it's not that we were wrong, but maybe we were wrong in how it was going to come to be, or we were mistaken in like the path we thought we would need to take to get there. And in the end, it might actually happen, but just in a way that's totally different than what we thought. If we even just take the regular life example of even like a spouse, how many people ends up in the kind of relationship that they wanted to be in, but it happened in a totally different kind of way, or with a person that was totally different than what they had envisioned. They end up getting to a related result, but there's a whole inner world of like give and take, of letting go of that vision and then reclaiming it. And I feel like that's something I can only imagine that Yosef went through something similar. It is true in the end, even without his brothers showing up, he becomes a leader of people who come to him and bow down to him. That is his life story. The piece of whether it's his brothers or not, that's like a sidebar in the broader vision that really does come true. Like, I would say that even if we never had our Parsha, the part where his brothers start showing up, those dreams were an accurate prediction of what Yosef's life would look like. So I think that that's interesting. Like, it's not necessarily that vision is wrong, but sometimes we have to realize that it can come true in a totally different kind of way. Like, maybe you or I might have a similar vision, didn't become a pulpit rabbi, but meaning we're doing other things that are using all the same skills, just in a different setting. Do you know what I'm saying? So I feel like sometimes it's not even just saying the story doesn't serve us. Certainly that's the case. And there are many times where we need to really let go of a narrative that is no longer working for us. But there are also times where we sort of have to be open to the fact that narrative can be manifest in our reality, but just in a way that we didn't envision.
Yeah, I like that. There's a midrash on this parasha, on the first words, Miketz. The midrash relates it to a pasuk from Iyov that says, Ketz sam lechoshech, which in its context is actually talking about a person who puts an end to darkness. But the midrash understands it as kind of, either God or fate. And it says, Zman nitan leYosef kama shanim ya'aseh be'afela bebet ha'asurim. So there was a certain time that was given to Yosef for how long he was going to be in prison. Kevan shehegia ketz chalam paro chalom. So as soon as that time arrived, that the end was in sight, Paro had the dream, and everything else began to happen. So the midrash is kind of saying, okay, there's a certain time that is set.
It's a redemption. The word kitz in the worldview of Chazal is redemption, and they constantly have, we have in the Gemara that debate of, does redemption come, or does it become because you're merited, or because that's the time that was predetermined? Right. So here it's saying it is not necessarily meriting, but his time has come.
Yeah. And then the midrash goes on to say that the same thing is true not just for Yosef, but for the entire world. Right? The midrash says, Ketz sam lechoshech zman nitan la'olam kama shanim ya'aseh ba'afela. That the whole world has the time that's already set for how long it will be dark and dismal, and that's going to come to an end. So on one level, I think that the midrash is, just suggesting, don't worry, hope is in sight. At some point, there's going to be redemption, as you suggest. But I think that it's also interesting that Parashat Miketz, we always read on Shabbat Chanukah. And when we read the parasha in that context, and specifically this midrash, I think it's also suggesting that, there's a tension between just waiting for things to happen and to say, okay, there's a certain time that's predetermined, and after that time, then things are going to change, things are going to transform. And a tension between that and between, the story of Hanukkah and the practices of Hanukkah, which I think are really more focused on, everyone do something small, and that can totally change reality, right? Like the story of Nes Pach HaShemen is a little kid who finds a little bit of oil, and then that is so transformative. And that's actually what we do also. What's the big celebration of Hanukkah? We don't stand in shul for hours and daven and blow the shofar or do any grandiose practices. What we do is Kedat Bet Hillel. We just light, one more candle every day, another candle and another candle, and we create light in the world. And I think that that's really part of when every year when we read Parashat Miketz during Hanukkah, I think that that's also part of another way of looking at it, that, there's the big dreams, there's the big story, there's a way of looking at reality that is, I'm living out a vision and this big historical moment, but that can also limit us. And sometimes just by doing small actions of lighting up the world, whether it's, my family relationships, or whether it's lighting up the world around me, doing actions for other people, I can also impact. I can shift that trajectory, and I can, rather than just being bound by my past, I can actually do something to go in a different direction and create a new story.
I think also just that description, or how you're portraying the Midrash, also really relates to how we've experienced the last year, meaning many people have said and feel that we're living in a historical moment. It clearly will be written down as a turning point in history.
Epic.
It's an epic moment in history that, I don't know, I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to be talking about in the past tense, or I feel like we're in like a transitional moment right now just within Israel. Like it still says in the news, X days in war, but I'm not totally sure I understand exactly. Okay, that's a sidebar about our political situation. But on the everyday level, I think most of us were trying to do that piece. Like most of us, if we weren't in the combat moment where you're very clear what you need to do right now, so we sort of were trying to do that, like to light those lights and to add something small, and to, while knowing that there's some broader thing hovering above us, I don't have anything to do with that right now. Like I don't know that's not mine to control, or I just can be in the moment and do something small. And I feel like a lot of times throughout this past year plus, like that's been a real internal space between feeling like pathetic and unhelpful versus being like trying to do something small and helpful. And it's that image, I think, like of the candle. Like there is some sort of broader image here. There will be some sort of kits, but I can't control that. So I think that like those words really invoke for me, like that internal space that I've experienced in the past year.
And ultimately, if there are enough people lighting those small candles, that really shifts history. That really creates a new narrative, a new sense of solidarity, a new sense of connection. And that impacts the outcome of, Am Yisrael, where Am Yisrael is going, and what the reality in this land will be like after the war ends.
Ayelet, thanks for being here.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks for talking, Yosef. And I also really like how this episode complements the previous one, because they were really focused on like sort of a particular trait of Yosef, how he ends up learning to listen, which was a really interesting insight on Tanya's part. And I love how here we've sort of looked at this broader question of what was Yosef trying to do, and how does this fit into like the broader trajectory of his life. And I think that we've sort of given it like fair treatment. I think that there are questions to be asked that we don't necessarily have an answer for. And I think that you have suggested some really insightful ways to sort of understand the trajectory of how Yosef's life develops and how he also wanted it to develop. So thanks for that. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.